Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit. Black Germans under Hitler and the Nazis. The Holocaust on January 27th commemoration, the date of liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, means that remembrance of Nazi crimes focuses on the systematic mass murder of Europe's Jews. The other victims of Nazi racism, including Europe's Sinti and Roma, are now routinely named in commemoration, but not all survivors have had equal opportunities to have their story heard. One group of victims who have yet to be publicly memorialized is Black Germans. All those voices need to be heard, not only for the sake of these survivors, but because we all need to see how varied the expressions of Nazi racism were if we are to understand the lessons of the Holocaust. When Hitler came to power in 1933, there were understood to have been some thousands of Black people living in Germany. They were never counted, and estimates vary widely. At the heart of an emerging Black community was a group of men from Germany's own African colonies, which were lost under the peace treaty that ended World War I, and their German wives. They were networked across Germany and abroad by ties of family and association, and some were active in communist and anti-racist organizations. Among the first acts of the Nazi regime was the suppression of Black political activism. There were also 600 to 800 children fathered by French colonial soldiers, many, though not all, African. When the French army occupied the Rhineland as part of the peace settlement after 1919, French troops were withdrawn in 1930, and the Rhineland was demilitarized under Hitler, stationed German units there in 1936. The denial of rights and work. In 1935, Nuremberg laws stripped Jews of their German citizenship and prohibited them from marrying or having sexual relations with people of German blood, white blood. A subsequent ruling confirmed that Black people, like gypsies, were to be regarded as being of alien blood and subject to the Nuremberg principles. Very few people of African descent had German citizenship, even if they were born in Germany. But this became irreversible when they were given passports that designated them as stateless Negroes. In 1941, Black children were officially excluded from public schools, but most of them had suffered racial abuse in their classrooms much earlier. Some were forced out of school, and none were permitted to go on to university or professional training. Published interviews and memoirs by both men and women, unpublished testimony, and post-war compensation claims testify to these and other shared experiences. Employment prospects were already poor before 1933 and got worse afterwards. Unable to find regular work, some were drafted and forced labor as foreign workers during World War II. Films and stage shows making propaganda for the return of Germany's African colonies became one of the few sources of income, especially after Black people were banned from other kinds of public performance in 1939. Incarcerations. When SS leader Heinrich Himmler undertook a survey of all black people in Germany and occupied Europe in 1942, he was probably contemplating a roundup of some kind, but there was no mass internment. Research in camp records and survivor testimony has so far thrown up around 20 black Germans who spent time in concentration camps and prisons, and at least one who was a euthanasia victim. The one case we have of a black person being sent to a concentration camp explicitly for being a Mischling, a mulatto, Gert Schramm, was interned in Buchenwald at age 15, comes from 1944. Instead, the process that ended the incarceration usually began with a charge of deviant or antisocial behavior. Being black made people visible to the police, and it became a reason not to release them once they were in custody. In this report, we can see black people as victims, not of a peculiarly Nazi racism, but of an intensified version of the kinds of everyday racism that still persists today. Sterilizations and assault on families. It was the Nazi fear of racial pollution that led to the most common trauma suffered by black Germans, the breakup of families. Mixed couples were harassed into separating. When others applied for marriage licenses, or when a woman was known to be pregnant or had a baby, the black partner became a target for involuntary sterilization. In a secret action in 1937, some 400 of the Rhineland children were forcibly sterilized. Other black Germans went into hiding or fled the country to escape sterilization, while news of friends and relatives who had not escaped intensified the fear that dominated people's lives. The black German community was new in 1933. In most families, the first generation born in Germany were just coming of age. In that respect, it was similar to the communities in France and Britain that were reforming around families founded by men from the colonies. Nazi persecution broke those families and the ties of community. One legacy of that was a long silence about the human face of Germany's colonial history, the possibility that black and white Germans could share a social and cultural space. That silence helps to explain Germans' mixed response to today's refugee crises, the welcome offered by German Chancellor, and many ordinary Germans was given voice to the liberal humanitarianism that was always present in German society and was reinforced by the lessons of the Holocaust. The reaction against refugees reveals the other side of the coin. Germans who fear immigration are not alone in Europe, but their anxieties draw on a vision that has remained very powerful in German society since 1945. The idea that however deserving they are, people who are not white cannot be German. The fate of Hitler's black victims, whether Afro-German or Afro-American soldiers and citizens, is often overlooked in the studies of World War II. The genocide of 6 million Jews is the central tragedy of the Holocaust, and more recent studies point to the persecution of the disabled and homosexuals. Yet, there is much more to be learned about Nazism from research on Nazi racial policies, particularly regarding Afro-Germans. Racial prejudices in Germany grew dramatically after World War I, as did anti-Semitism. Those who had lived in Germany or German colonies in Africa lost their positions under the 1919 Treaty of Versailles and brought back racist ideologies. Racial hysteria erupted with the occupation of the Rhineland by African and South Asian soldiers in the French colonial army who were enforcing the reparations. The Germans, or the Nazis, tragically built on this pre-existing German and Anglo-Saxon fear, distrust, and hatred of blacks to justify even greater persecution. By 1937, the sterilization of and then murder of hundreds of Afro-Germans as well as black soldiers became an important, tragic, and still misunderstood component of Nazi policy. The Black Horror on the Rhine, German and U.S. race propaganda, interracial relationships between German women in the Rhineland and Senegalese or other African soldiers from the French army led to the birth of several hundred mixed-race Afro-German children. These families and their children brought a new identity to interwar Germany. However, some Germans, as well as Americans and British journalists and activists, used these relationships for their racist propaganda. They made films such as Black Horror on the Rhine and posters depicting black soldiers as rapists who were a threat to the purity of white women and carriers of deadly venereal diseases. This racist propaganda was amplified by racist white Americans and had been the case with the 1915 film, Birth of a Nation. That film was shown by the racist President Woodrow Wilson in the White House during his presidency and led to a rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. White American racists influenced German and Nazi scientists, politicians, and others, and vice versa. America's one-drop rule and laws against intermarriage between the races influenced the Nazis when they drafted the Nuremberg laws. These were German laws that discriminated against blacks, Jews, and other minorities. Additionally, Hitler blamed the Jews for African soldiers being stationed and reproducing in Germany with German women. Afro-German children who were a product of these relationships were referred to as Rhineland bastards and were seen as a threat to the racial purity of Germany. The rise of Nazism and racism, 1933 through 41. Unfortunately, Afro-German children were isolated from German society. They could not go to German universities. They were barred from numerous jobs and banned from the military. Intermarriage with blacks was made illegal in 1935 as an additional part of the Nuremberg laws. Black people were banned from publicly performing in 1939 and going to school in state schools in Austria, Germany in 1939 through 41. This was justified by a racist German scientist and member of the Nazi Party, Eugene Fischer, who lectured on June 20th, 1939 to argue that black people are inferior and should be suppressed. Theodor Wanja Michael grew up in Nazi Germany, the product of a Cameroonian father and a German woman. Throughout his youth, he appeared in Human exhibit shows, and his black father could not get employment anywhere because of his race. In a BBC article, he describes his experiences of black people in these human exhibits. The idea was that black people on display were foreign, exotic, and were showing spectators what their homeland was like, he states. Basically, it was just a big show. He also stated that I avoided all contact with white women. That would have been horrible. I would have been sterilized, and I might also have been charged with racial defilement. The persecution soon escalated to sterilization. A German doctor, Dr. Hans Mako, supported and encouraged sterilization in Afro-German children in 1933. The Nazis rounded up 365 Afro-German children who were sterilized by German doctors in 1937. One victim of sterilization was Hans Hoch, the son of a white German woman and an Algerian man, taken without consent or permission to get an unprecedented vasectomy. After his vasectomy, he was forced to sign an agreement that stated he would not have sexual intercourse or romantic relations with people of German heritage, white people. In addition, in the files of the Reich Ministry of Interior files, one Afro-German girl named Mary Ann Braun, whose father was from a French colonial African country and stationed in Rhineland, was admitted to a Maine state hospital. There, in the hospital, she was sterilized on June 3rd, 1937. Others disappeared at the hands of the Gestapo or the SS, and there were Afro-Germans sent to concentration camps. A concentration camp survivor, Jan Waschik, witnessed Afro-Germans in the concentration camp she was in, and another victim of the Nazi regime, Hilarius Gilge, was tortured and murdered by 6 SS members. Hilarius was from a working class family and a member of a local communist party. Fortunately, today, there's a plaza in his hometown of Dusseldorf to commemorate his life. He is survived by his 2 children and a wife who receive money from the state as compensation for his murder. An Afro-German of Cameroonian and German heritage, Sonia K., was expelled from high school for being black after Hitler came to power. She could not get any jobs due to her skin color, so she moved to France and performed on stage as a dancer. When she returned to Germany, she had to provide evidence that she was Aryan. The German government did a background check on her family and discovered her father was baptized as a Jew. So she was banned from performing on stage, and her mother was forced to work hard labor. Adding to the complication was that Sonia K. became impregnated by her partner, a white German man, in 1941. As a result of this, she had to meet with the Gestapo in a meeting where she was threatened with sterilization. After that, Sonia K. lived underground illegally in Berlin and then eventually moved to Prague with her partner, where she was arrested by the Gestapo in 1944. During her imprisonment, she was tortured and contracted tuberculosis. She was not released until the liberation was secured. World War II, beyond Afro-Germans. Black Americans, Black British soldiers, and even Black American entertainers were not exempt from Nazi racist ideologies and persecution. A Black American jazz singer, Valeda Snow, was placed in a concentration camp during a tour in Europe for not only being black but also being lesbian. She spent 2 years in a concentration camp. When she was released, she was malnourished, weighed only 65 pounds, and never the same again. Another example is performer and World War I veteran Mohammed Hussein, born in what is now Tanzania. Interestingly, he contributed to the German colonialism movement and supported human zoos. But he was later sent to a concentration camp in Sachsenhausen by the Gestapo for having sexual marital relations with white women. He had several children by his white wife and white mistress. He eventually died there in 1949, and today he has a monument honoring him. Furthermore, in 1945, a witness saw a Black American airman get brutally executed by the citizens of a German town called Iserlohn at the demand of the Gestapo. Unfortunately, no one was ever charged for the heinous crime. In addition, numerous Black British soldiers were worked or starved to death in concentration camps, as well as German war prison camps. Revelations.Unveiled.Detroit